Driven to madness in that circled forest, he removed his burden. Then she seized the tambourine, turned to her followers and sang to them.
In Cattalus' 63rd poem, a beautiful young man sails away from his homeland to join the cult of the goddess Cybele. In a mountain grove, caught up in religious ecstasy, he dramatically changes gender, swearing to devote his life to the goddess.
However, the next morning, Atis realises the full consequences of what she's done. When the sun with flashing eyes began to steep, she saw clearly what she had done. Her spirit seethed with grief as she wandered back to the shore,
where weeping, she gazed out at the desolate expanse.
Atis had cut herself off, not just from masculinity, but also from her homeland. Her status had shifted from a male citizen to a female foreign slave. As Atis laments her permanent shift in identity, we're left wondering how the story is going to resolve. Will Atis be restored to her original state?
Or maybe goddess Cybele will comfort her and show there are benefits to her new status. What happens next is quite disturbing. No sooner had Attis's rosy lips voiced her complaint, hoping to rouse the goddess's compassion, than Mother Cybele, with merciless contempt, uncoupled her lion. The beast roused himself, roared, and charged to the whitening seashore, where tender Atis was uttering her despair. Mad with fear, the young woman ran into the wild woods, and there remained enslaved forever, a handmaid to the goddess.
This poem is strange for a number of reasons. Cattalus was writing around 50 BC. At that point, the cult of Cybele with its eunuch priests had been present in Rome for over a century, and yet he presents it as something foreign. Interestingly, the beautiful Atis, who transgresses Roman gender norms, is a sympathetic figure. It is the goddess Cybele who comes out worst. She appears capricious, ungrateful, and most of all, cruel.
There's a tendency among modern scholars to view the cult of Cybele as a kind of safe haven for gender non-conforming people in ancient Rome, and there may be some truth to this. But what is often forgotten is the element of cruelty which marked out the cult. Perhaps this is why fewer people know about Cybele today compared to Venus or Persephone. The attempt by some Romans to make her the 13th Olympian failed. Nevertheless, she occupied a magnificent temple in the heart of Rome, funded by the Senate. Cybele wore the mural crown. She was the protector of the great city and her emperors.
So why did the Roman state purposefully import and then endorse this foreign, cruel, gender-bending goddess?
Hi, I'm Josh and welcome to Blue Fawn, an AI-free channel where we look at religious and esoteric history. I hope you have as much fun watching this video as I have making it. We're going to be discussing some sensitive topics and examining points of view that could be considered upsetting today. I'd love to know what you think, so let me know in the comments.
In Herodotus' histories, he tells us about a pharaoh who wanted to know which people on earth were the most ancient. So he made a plan. He left 2 babies with a shepherd, sworn to a vow of silence. Having never heard anyone speak, the children invented their own words, and to the pharaoh's astonishment, they were speaking Phrygian, proving that the Phrygians were the most ancient of all peoples.
In fact, the inhabitants of Phrygia in modern Turkey experienced repeated invasions from both the east and the west. Some things survived. Phrygians had their own language and script, which they briefly maintained. But what really endured the armies of Celts, Alexandrian soldiers and Persians was the wild landscape. Kings came and went, new people arrived and intermarried, but it was the mountains that remained the same. Dotting the hills and valleys were ancient mounds and the ruins of prehistoric cities. Among the stones were mysterious figurines, seated pregnant women and ferocious beasts.
Perhaps the pharaoh had been right. Although the people came and went, the land of Phrygia itself was very ancient indeed.
Of course the Phrygians knew this. Their supreme goddess was called the Mother of the Mountain. She was more than a deity. She was nature itself in all its Anatolian cruelty, mistress of savage lions and fertile crops. Statues of this goddess standing in doorways appear around 700 BC. She was a mediator at the boundary, with power over the city and the wilderness, the world of the living and the dead, the known and the unknown. The Mountain Mother was never depicted with children or breastfeeding. She was respectfully clothed, with a distinctive hat. This stood in contrast to her festivals. In ancient Greece, the Phrygians were famous for their music and dancing, especially those connected with Cybele. Like an even crazier version of the festivals of Bacchus, participants whipped themselves into a frenzy, beating drums and blowing pipes.
So this is sadly not a Phrygian instrument, it's an Armenian duduk, so a little east of Phrygia. But nevertheless, I hope you can imagine what the Phrygian music might have sounded like. That was my attempt to play the Phrygian mode, which, according to the Greeks, was a famous scale that came from Phrygia. We can imagine the followers of Cybele whipping themselves into a frenzy as this kind of music was played, accompanied by tambourines and drums and other flutes.
Later Roman sources mention an orgy of self-inflicted violence. Writing in the 1st century AD, Flaccus describes the cult centre of Cybele, where worshippers revel with blood-stained arms. It's possible this reflects Phrygian custom, although, as I'll show later, this theme of cruelty was also developed by the Romans. The Phrygians worshipped another god who bridged boundaries. Agdistis, perhaps a child of the Mountain Mother, had male and female body parts.
By about 300 BC, Phrygian cities like Pessinus were ruled by eunuch priest kings, always named Atis. Perhaps, like their goddess, they acted as mediators, men who had sacrificed everything to bridge the great divides, maybe including that between men and women.
By this point, the cult had spread far beyond Phrygia. Cybele's exotic authority was attractive to the Greeks and Cretans. A temple was built in Athens. The full story of how the cult spread is lost to us, but we can imagine it was carried by intelligent travelling priests and priestesses who knew how to exploit others' interest in foreign knowledge, like the ones we met in the cult of Isis. By about 200 BC, Cybele had a growing reputation as a powerful and outlandish goddess, someone you might turn to in an absolute crisis, and it so happened, around the same time, Rome experienced just that. Locked in the Second Punic War with Carthage, the leaders of Rome were horrified by a series of meteor showers. Were these omens of defeat? Searching through the prophetic Sibylline books, they found the solution. The Phrygian goddess Cybele must be imported to Rome to guarantee the defeat of Carthage.
I wonder what the citizens of Pessinus thought when the Romans marched into their city, demanding the statue of their goddess. Well, we know that eventually a compromise was reached between the two parties. The Romans could take the effigy back with them, on the condition it was accompanied by a group of Galli, Cybele's eunuch priests.
The black stone, probably a meteorite, was transported with reverence and awe. The Senate built a temple and held an annual festival for the goddess. A few years later, the war with Carthage ended. The Great Mother had demonstrated her power.
When many people think about ancient Rome, stoic military masculinity comes to mind, and that's not completely wrong. At the same time the cult of Cybele was starting in the great city, another mystery religion was spreading through the poorer suburbs of Rome. It was the cult of Bacchus, which was famously banned by the Senate because it was led by women and corrupting the youth. So why in the world was the Roman state funding the eunuch priest kings of Cybele?
One simple reason is that these priests gave the Roman Senate what they wanted. In 189 BC, they prophesied Roman victory in war with the Galatians. In 103 BC, they publicly addressed the Senate and were treated with respect. These Galli were competent political operators used to running their own city in Phrygia. As for their flamboyant behaviour, dressed in coloured robes with huge necklaces and gold crowns, as long as they didn't claim to be Roman, all was well.
Like us, ancient Romans had many different ways of understanding gender. One of them was that masculinity was a balance between extremes.
On the one hand were boorish savages. Such men lacked self-control. They were hard, hairy, and over-hot. It was a choice to behave like this, but it could also be the result of physical problems in the body. One of the four humours was out of balance. There was too much fiery blood in this person's veins. On the other end of the spectrum was someone who was too cold and soft. An effeminate man could not speak with authority or lead his household. Many educated men worried about maintaining balanced Roman masculinity. It was tied up with being a good citizen of a high social class. Cattalus the poet tells us one of his friends used to sleep with weights on his kidneys to prevent having wet dreams. The man was worried losing blood at night was making him effeminate. Romans believed semen was hot blood. This anxiety over maintaining masculinity led the Senate to ban Romans from becoming priests of Cybele. The Galli were confined to their temple, only allowed out at the annual festival of Megalencia, when they carried the effigy of the goddess through the city. Writing in the 1st century BC, Dionysius of Halicarnassus describes a clear division of responsibilities.
The praetors perform sacrifices and celebrate games in the goddess's honour every year, but by law of the Senate, it is forbidden for any native Roman to march in the procession through the city arrayed in flamboyant robes, or to dance to the sound of the pipes, or to honour the goddess with any of the Phrygian ceremonies.
That's a very interesting source, because I think we're starting to get another idea about why the state funded the cult of Cybele. It was so different. It made people feel more Roman. Romanness, Roman masculinity, was defined in opposition to it. They not like us. In Varro's lost play, Eumenides, written about 70 BC, a man returning from a late-night banquet wanders into the temple complex of Cybele. To pass unobserved, he dresses himself in drag and pretends to be a Phrygian priest. The Galli appear like beautiful nymphs in the moonlight. Their mysterious songs and instruments are like something from a dream. Seduced by the music and beauty, the Roman clings to the altar and refuses to leave when unmasked. Eventually the Galli have to drag him out. "Enough insanity. Leave our home," they tell him.
In this story, dressing up and acting out is simply not enough to become one of the Galli. At the end of the story, our protagonist remains a Roman man. To think otherwise would be insane. The Galli were outsiders from the East with their own bizarre ways, totally cut off from Roman gender identities.
Remember Cattalus' poem we read at the beginning of the video? In that story, the only way the youth can become a Galla, Cattalus uses the feminine word, is to completely revoke his old identity.
In fact, he gives up his gender, his class, and his country. That's not a decision to take lightly, if it's even possible. But despite being viewed as totally other, it didn't stop the Galli being a source of curiosity for many ordinary Romans.
The myth of Atis is probably a Greek invention, but it accompanied the cult of Cybele to Rome and was a somewhat popular story. In the tale, Atis is set to marry a princess before he meets the goddess Cybele, and struck by her divine, awesome beauty, he unmans himself, swearing to spend eternity as her slave. In Rome, Atis became a minor deity in his own right. Archaeologists have discovered lots of little clay figurines of him. Perhaps some of these plebs also liked his elusive, effeminate followers, the Galli. But things were about to change.
In about 20 BC, Emperor Augustus began a series of reforms and building programs. As a result, the rituals at the Temple of Cybele were adapted slightly. The Galli began to wash the effigy of the goddess in a local river, visible to the Roman public. The Galli were seen out and about more often on the streets of Rome. It became harder to think of them as something totally cut off. And for some writers, they began to pose a threat to Roman gender norms.
In his Aeneid, where he describes the origins of Rome, Virgil's hero Aeneas is sometimes accused of being a Gallus.
"Grant that I lay the Phrygian eunuch out on the ground and grind dirt into his pretty hair,"
shouts an enemy king before battle. In the tale, Aeneas must overcome his Phrygian roots to establish masculine Romanness and found the great city.
But if Romans came from Phrygia originally, could they go back to being Galli? Maybe the idea wasn't so insane, after all.
This menacing effeminacy horrified writers like Livy or Ovid, who condemned the Galli as depraved, even as they praised their goddess Cybele. But it's in the poetry of Martial, writing in the 1st century AD, that we find the most insulting descriptions of the once revered priests.
Now, sadly, I can't read most of these poems on YouTube because they're simply too dirty. But I can tell you that they present the Galli as depraved and dangerous, a threat to men and women and the stability of the Roman household.
The Galli were spending more time in public, but there was another reason for this shift in the way people saw them. As the empire grew and provincial elite cultures formed, it became harder to see the Galli as totally other. Aelius Aristides could famously declare, "Neither sea nor intervening continent are bars to citizenship, nor are Asia and Europe divided. In this empire, all paths are open to all."
Now, in the minds of many Roman writers, the Galli, the eunuch followers of Cybele, were defined not so much by their foreignness as by their depravity and their cult of cruelty. All those beautiful images of nymphs in the moonlight singing Phrygian songs are replaced by howls and shrieks and festivals of blood. As the status of her followers changed, Cybele became crueler, but remained untouchable. She was the sacred protector of the city. In fact, this new dynamic quite pleased a lot of Romans. The Galli were turned into eunuch slaves by the commanding goddess. Only masculine, stoic Romans could hold firm while they worshipped her. The performative suffering of the Galli became a reassuring sight.
When festal torches gleam in the city streets, who would think that cruel wounds have lately gushed in her temples? Asked Valerius Flaccus. The poet Statius describes a Galli who flagellates himself while tossing his gory hair. Martial, on the other hand, criticizes a barber who was always cutting his clients by accident. He was worse than the Galli during their frenzied dances. Romans recognized this kind of physical suffering, this loss of control over the body. It was what slaves endured. The emphasis on cruelty as a way to other the Galli affected the rites of Cybele. A new ritual emerged, the taurobolium, a bull sacrifice where the animal was kept alive while its living blood was collected. Overseeing the ceremony was the new high priest, the archigallus, a Roman non-eunuch who kept the untrustworthy Galli in check. Like the other mystery cults, the Romans had made Cybele into their own image. Now they began exporting her across the empire. Temples were built along the African coast. On returning to Pessinus, the city where this all began, the Romans were scandalized to discover the comparatively humble rituals of the Mountain Mother. A shining white temple complex was built in the city, connecting worship of Cybele with the emperor.
But where some saw depravity and cruelty, others found spiritual enlightenment and truth. Writing around 250 AD, the famous Neoplatonic philosopher Plotinus wrote about the Galli when discussing his perspective on the unimportance of the material world. The Galli had shunned their physical bodies to contemplate the perfect idea, the beautiful goddess Cybele. That was a really good example of what he wanted people to do in their own lives.
Plotinus wasn't the only one thinking like this. Early Christian and Gnostic sects near Phrygia found something they recognized in the mysteries of Cybele. The Christian apologist Hippolytus, writing around the same time, claims that the Nazarenes, an early sect of Christian Gnostics, often attended the rituals of the goddess.
They constantly attended mysteries called those of the Great Mother. The only difference was that they were not eunuchs, but with the utmost severity they forbade their followers from making love. Now, we really have to be careful when reading Hippolytus's book against the heretics. It's essentially a long list of people he disagrees with and a discussion of why they're wrong. So he doesn't always give us an accurate description of what people actually believed. In my historical fantasy novel, the main character is a Gnostic detective, and in one of the stories he believes he may have discovered a clue to a murder in one of Hippolytus's books. So he rushes to the library to begin reading it to look for the clue, and he opens the page and there is a very insulting description of his version of Gnosticism, and of course he's very upset by that. So we have to be careful with Hippolytus, but there were some small groups who definitely reflected the Galli while claiming to be Christians.
Some groups went further. The Valesian sect believed Jesus had commanded every man to be made into a eunuch. They famously kidnapped travellers and forced them to join their ranks.
Today, the cult of Cybele seems to be completely opposed to many of our popular ideas about Christianity, but in the late Roman Empire there were actually several points of similarity. Christian asceticism, the denial of the body, was extremely popular. The cult of the martyrs, which celebrated the gruesome suffering of the saints, wasn't so different to the suffering of the Galli. Christians were aware similarities could be drawn, and they worked hard to distance themselves from the cult.
Theodore of Amasea, a young soldier born on the edge of Cybele's heartland, converted to Christianity at some point in the 3rd century. When asked to make a sacrifice to the gods, he refused, landing him in jail. But the local magistrate took pity on him and agreed to pardon him unconditionally. Seemingly fixated on his own martyrdom, Theodore immediately went and burned down the local temple of Cybele. This time there was no mercy. He was subjected to a very painful end.
Theodore became a very popular saint. His shrines dotted the hills and valleys of Anatolia. In around 350 AD, the Empress Eusebia made sure that his relics were returned to his home city. His story is interesting to us because Theodore seems to mirror the devoted suffering of Atis, the follower of Cybele, while simultaneously condemning it.
Since Christian emperors refused to have anything to do with Cybele, her rites became a kind of pagan defiance. Famous senators began to commission altars to the goddess with their names inscribed. Benefiting from this new polarized patronage, the Galli became more visible in the archaeological record. We find engravings of them, decked out in their resplendent robes and jewels. When Emperor Julian tried to revive paganism in the 360s, he visited Pessinus, the original site of the cult of Cybele. He was severely disappointed by the lack of religious enthusiasm in the city. We know this because he wrote a long letter complaining about it, offering to spend lots of money to revive the popularity of the cult in Phrygia. A bit like Plotinus, Julian believed that the mysteries of the Great Mother communicated profound truths about the universe. They must be preserved.
Oops. Who then is the mother of the gods? She is the source of all intelligible and creative powers. She is dispenser of all life, causes all birth, herself a virgin, sharing the throne of Jupiter. O mother of gods and men, giver of life and maker of souls, grant to the Roman people universally, first and foremost, to wash away the stain of Christianity, and, secondly, grant them good fortune that shall assist them in governing this empire for many thousands of years to come.
Julian's pagan revival was short-lived, but his writing does give us a window onto the mindset of opponents of Christianity. It's possible this pagan anxiety translated into more extreme and elaborate rituals. If we can believe Christian writers like Prudentius, now the high priest stood under the sacrifice grid and drank the blood from the bull.
He tilts his head backwards, exposing his cheeks, his ears, his lips, his nostrils, even his eyes. He soaks his tongue in it until his whole body is filled with that terrible, dark blood.
Prudentius's account is found in his collection on the Christian martyrs. In his story, a martyr stands before a judge who is about to condemn him to death and gives a detailed explanation as to why the suffering Galli are not the same as Christian saints. Galli who harm themselves for Cybele are missaid by demons, people to be pitied, Martyrs, on the other hand, suffer out of love for Christ at the hands of cruel persecutors. They don't want to suffer. It's not something they're looking for. Well, we already know from the story of Theodore, this argument doesn't always hold up. Cybele and her Galli gradually fade from the historical record in the 5th century. Christian emperors discontinued her worship in Rome. All those inscribed altars commissioned by pagan senators were buried under the Vatican.
If people remembered the cult of Cybele for anything, it was for its inconsiderate excess. Around 410 AD, Bishop Synesius of Cyrene wrote a rather funny letter complaining about his niece, who insisted on wearing her wedding dress at a funeral. Seated on a chair with double cushions and silver feet, she complained about her bad luck and said the deceased should have died earlier. She was actually annoyed at us because we were sad. Next week she is planning to present herself crowned with fillets and with a towering headdress, like Cybele. Synesius talks about Cybele in the context of bad taste in fashion and inconsiderate, haughty behaviour. There's no mention of the Galli at all. They were on their way out, their networks of patronage dissolving as the empire Christianized.
New challenges to Roman gender norms came from Christianity, not paganism. Monks swearing eternal chastity and fighting lecherous demons in the desert. Cross-dressing saints like Mary Marianus, who became icons of veneration. And learned men like Jerome encouraging young women to starve themselves to become infertile.
As the Great Mother faded into the background, people found other ways to shape and escape gender expectations. But what do you think of the cult of Cybele?
Let me know in the comments. And well done if you've been following the series. This is the last episode on the ancient mystery cults. Next video, we're starting a new series looking at magic in the Greek and Roman world. See you then.